Another war may be on the horizon. A major escalation of tensions between Russia and Ukraine dominated international headlines today. A face-off on the Black Sea, in fact, has heightened the risk of a fresh conflict. It began on Sunday when Ukraine sent 2 gunboats and a tug from the Odessa port in the Black Sea. These boats were traveling to Mariupol. On the way, Russian boats tried to intercept the Ukrainian vessels. One of these boats even rammed the Ukrainian tug. Ukraine claims that the Russian military opened fire on its ships. Kiev, that's the capital of Ukraine, says that 6 of its sailors were wounded and its vessels were seized. A total of 23 Ukrainians were on board these ships.
Я звертаюся до керівництва Російської Федерації з вимогою негайно звільнити українських військовослужбовців, які в порушенні міжнародного права брутально були затримані і доля яких невідома. Ми вимагаємо терміново їх передати українській стороні.
Now here's Russia's version. It says that the Ukrainian ship was illegally trying to enter its waters. Later, Russia dispatched 2 fighter jets and 2 helicopters to this area.
On yesterday's incident, this was a definite provocation. All that was needed to be said has been said by the Border Guard Service of the FSB and in the Foreign Ministry statements. Key principles of the international law was violated, not only the maritime legislation, but general international law, including the United Nations Charter.
This issue is about access to the Sea of Azov. A treaty in 2003 guarantees free navigation to Russian and Ukrainian vessels, but recently Russia has increased its military presence in the region. All vessels going to and from Ukrainian ports via the Sea of Azov are reportedly being inspected by the Russians now. The war of words between Russia and Ukraine is growing louder. There is no saying when it might turn into an actual war. Both sides are blaming each other for violating the laws of the sea. Russia has called for an emergency session of the United Nations Security Council. They're scheduled to meet today. While the world is watching this flare-up, it also has a bearing on the internal politics of Ukraine. Look at these images. Dozens of Ukrainian citizens gathered outside the Russian embassy in Kiev to protest against Moscow's actions. Similar protests were seen outside the Russian consulate in Kharkiv. Ukrainian President Petro Poroshenko has declared martial law pending the approval of his parliament. More on that later. For the moment, let's get voices from all sides to understand this standoff better. With me is a very special panel tonight. Franak Viakorka, the new media editor for Radio Free Europe, joining us from Belarus this evening. Catherine Quinn, judge, the Ukraine analyst with the International Crisis Group, with us from Kiev in Ukraine. And Fred Weir, Russian affairs expert, with us from Moscow in Russia. Good evening to all of you, and thank you very much for being with us here on Gravitas. Franak, I want to begin with you, and I want to begin with a statement from the Russian Foreign Ministry, and I'm quoting. It says this incident has been devised to divert attention from the internal problems that are ravaging Ukraine and blame the neighbor responsible for all of Ukraine's troubles. Do you agree?
I disagree. I think that's a speculation. Russia definitely provoked Ukraine. And one of the tasks is, of course, to weaken Ukrainian government, Ukrainian military forces, but also to block Ukrainian imports and exports, because as we know, 25% of Ukrainian iron exports are going from Mariupol. So Russia is always hiding its activities, its war actions behind good words about the common interest.
Fred, do you agree? Who do you think broke the law here? And if Ukraine did Russia not escalate it by firing on the ships?
Yeah, I think that's hard to discern who is responsible for this particular incident. But the problem is that since Russia annexed the Crimean Peninsula, they only access the transit point between those 2 seas, the Black Sea and the Azov, is a Kerch Strait. It's a very narrow strait. Russia now controls both sides of it and imposes its rules on any ships going through. They say it's something like the Bosphorus, where people have to ask permission, accept a pilot, and so on to go through those straits. Unfortunately, the world community and Ukraine don't agree that international law is on Russia's side, and that's why this has been a flashpoint for almost 5 years now, and will remain so. On any given day, you can have an incident like this, and it's a question of why now. And of course, the Russians say that Petro Poroshenko wanted to declare martial law. He wanted an excuse for it, so he sent these boats in without giving notice to the Russians, according to the way Ukrainian shipping has been doing for the past several years. They've been accepting Russian rules for transiting those straits. The Russians say that these 3 boats didn't do that. Ukraine, of course, says Russia is looking to blockade the strait and strangle Ukraine's economy, although the latest news does seem to show that they've reopened the strait for civilian traffic.
Catherine, it's Moscow's word against Kiev's. There's been no independent investigation. Which side are you inclined to believe then?
Well, listen, so both sides have their very clear chronologies as to who provoked whom. The Ukrainians say clearly that they made several attempts to notify the Russian border guard that they were sending these ships through. The Russian side says that they received no notification and that these ships were not on the schedule for that day. However, regardless of whose side we believe, the fact that Russia insists that it was protecting its territorial waters is premised on an interpretation of its border, i.e. it's premised on an interpretation of its unilateral annexation of Crimea as legitimate, right, that the rest of the world doesn't share. So regardless of whose chronology we believe, Russia is still on shaky ground as far as international law is concerned.
Fred, do you agree?
Yeah, sure. That's exactly it. Russia annexed Crimea. It's a de facto thing. They now control that strait, and that therefore have a stranglehold on access to the Sea of Azov. The problem is that there is this state of high tension between Russia and Ukraine. It's not resolved, and it won't be anytime soon. And these kind of incidents will happen again, and they will escalate.
Franak, the president's first reaction to this conflict was to push for martial law. Is this President Poroshenko's way of pushing back the March election, which he is most likely not going to win if reports are to be believed?
So martial law is imposed already. There was a vote in just 1 hour ago, and the Parliament of Ukraine supported this decision. So it doesn't say that the presidential elections will be postponed or cancelled. It only means that the army will be mobilized and all the state resources will be put on the defense. Poroshenko emphasized in his speech that it's not only about the sea conflict, that Russia also increased its presence on the near the border with Ukraine. So according to Poroshenko and Ukrainian officials, the conflict could continue and could escalate not only on the sea, but also on the land. So we will see what will happen next, but I think we are witnessing now the escalation of the conflict, which could lead to the big full-scale war. The big component of this war, of course, will be informational one. Last night it was a very good example how Russians mobilized their trolls in order to protect and to support their position.
Russia has also taken it to the United Nations Security Council. Fred, what does Moscow hope to achieve there?
I think they want to put a spotlight on their point of view. They know perfectly well that they can't get any resolutions passed through the Security Council, but they want they want a platform for their point of view and to focus on the what they think that Ukraine caused this in order, or triggered this event in order to crack down politically. And the state of emergency, or the martial law that has been passed, is quite sweeping. I mean, it gives government control of the media if it wants. It can impose, can ban all kinds of peaceful demonstrations. It's good for 60 days, and it gives Poroshenko sweeping powers. It is really surprising that after everything that's happened, hot war, the annexation of Crimea, they never imposed martial law, but that he's doing it now is, I think, really worrisome.
Indeed it is. And Catherine, the NATO Secretary General has pledged the alliance's quote-unquote full support for Ukraine's territorial integrity. How do you read this? Is this assurance of military support in the event of this conflict escalating?
I mean, what I do know is that immediately prior to the shootout last night, Ukraine's Minister of Internal Affairs went on record as saying that we need much more than your assurances of full support. We need actual concrete action from the West. That's not a guarantee that they're going to get it. However, I think what we're seeing now is an increased willingness on Ukraine's part to try to push for this.
And you're in Kiev, so I have to ask you this. Is there tension in the air? How do the locals view these developments, Catherine?
I mean, it depends which locals you're talking to. So right now I'm in a work hub full of young professionals and it's very much being discussed. However, if you go to a regular coffee shop, people are largely trying, as they have for the past 4 years, to forget that there is a war going on in their country.
Fred, do you see this escalating or is this just posturing at this point?
I don't see it escalating into full-scale war. I don't think it suits either side. I don't think the Russians want that. I don't think Mr. Poroshenko wants that, but definitely the tensions will continue. They might ratchet up, and unfortunately, in situations like this, they can just explode. There can be a miscalculation or something, and suddenly we'll find ourselves in a really bad situation.
Can I also just add, though, that there is already a war. There's already still a hot war in Donbass, and hundreds and thousands of Ukrainians on both sides of the line of separation live in daily constant risk of violations of their right to life and their right to property and livelihoods. So I think really the really scary thing about this escalation is that it's a potential way to take the focus off of solving those people's problems, which are not going away.
And Franak, I have to ask you this. Does this escalation help President Poroshenko's chances in the March election?
I think there is a version that Poroshenko will try to postpone elections, and of course he needs this point, and first of all he wants to neutralize some of his main opponents, especially those who came from show business. But definitely I wouldn't connect, because this is what Russian propaganda constantly repeat, this connection between martial law and the presidential elections. I think, we must... Yeah, please.
Sorry, can I just add that this isn't just Russian propaganda, though? A very strong supporter of the Maidan uprising, Yeshchenko, wrote a post today arguing that he also believed that this was the current government's, the current government was going to use this escalation, right, to postpone the elections. Ukrainian patriots have been speculating for months that Poroshenko may try to declare martial law ahead of the elections. So it isn't just Russian propaganda, although obviously they take the theme and they run with it, no doubt.
Franak.
Yeah, so I also read this message of Sergei Leshchenko. I understand that he can use this, but it doesn't exclude the fact that Russia violates the international maritime legislation, and it attacks the ships. And the reaction of Ukraine and of the West should be pretty clear. And I don't understand why we still didn't hear the strong position or statement by NATO or European Union, because I think this is a test not for Kyiv, this is a test for the West, for Brussels and Washington. How will they react? Or they will repeat the same scenario what happened in 2014 with Crimea, because they basically ignored the fact, and which allowed Russia just to occupy the Crimea without having a real fight. Or they will react sharply, and they will prevent Russia from escalating the conflict. So now the ball is on the side of the West as well.
Well, we'll see how that plays out. Thanks very much, Franak, Catherine and Fred. Appreciate you joining us and sharing your thoughts. So in the simplest of terms, this really is a turf battle. Russia sees Ukraine as its backyard. It wants regional dominance. Ukraine wants to be part of the European Union. The West supports it. Hence this conflict. It's not just the fishing vessel incident from March this year or the annexation of Crimea that the guests were talking about that created unrest in the region in the first place. In fact, tensions date back to 1991. The year Ukraine was born. Here's a quick recap of the Ukraine-Russia conflict over the years.
Ukraine is a relatively young state, but its rich history dates back thousands of years. The country became independent in 1991 with the dissolution of the Soviet Union, following centuries of Russian and Austrian dominance. But early on, roots of conflict were already taking hold in this new nation, pro-Europeans in the west and pro-Russians in the east. The pro-Russians also live in Crimea, although most of the rest of Ukraine now supports better relations with the United States and the European Union. Crimea was attached to Ukraine in 1954 and annexed by Russia in March 2014 in a move that was condemned by the West as illegal. Shortly after, armed separatists loyal to Moscow declared people's republics in the two southeastern regions. Effects of the Ukraine-Russia conflict have been felt across Europe. Moscow and Kiev have had repeated gas price disputes, which at times saw parts of the European Union not receive their Russian fuel shipments, which mostly go through Ukraine. The European Union and the US have imposed economic sanctions on Russia over its takeover of Crimea and backing for the eastern insurgents, with Moscow issuing a tit-for-tat response that's been unpopular with some European farmers and producers. Civilians have also been caught up in the fighting. In July 2014, a passenger plane flying from Amsterdam to Kuala Lumpur was shot down over rebel-held territory in eastern Ukraine, killing all 298 people on board. International investigators say the plane was shot down from rebel territory by a missile brought in from Russia, but Moscow and the insurgents deny responsibility. Nearly 10,000 people have been killed in fighting since April 2014, and some 1.7 million Ukrainians have been internally displaced.
A blame game is driving the current dispute between Russia and Ukraine. You would be aware about the major player on the Russian side, but let's now introduce you to the main player on the Ukrainian side, at least for now. We're talking about the president, Petro Poroshenko. Poroshenko was known as the chocolate king of Ukraine. He took office with support from the West, but now there is a deep mistrust over his leadership. His critics accuse him of pushing an agenda that is largely self-serving.
Petro Poroshenko made his fame and fortune as Ukraine's largest chocolate maker. But at the turn of this century, he gained the reputation of a savvy politician. In 2004, Ukraine's chocolate king was a key backer of the Orange Revolution. But Poroshenko's shot at presidency would only come 10 years later. The West cheered his election win because he promised a modern Ukraine.
All previous presidential elections divide the country. All previous presidential election has that the president-elect has the support of half of the country. And only now we have a unique situation that country can be united.
But the Ukrainian president has been unable to fulfill his promises. Despite 4 years of Poroshenko's rule, Ukraine remains Europe's poorest country. During his tenure, Petro Poroshenko found himself caught in the Panama Papers web. Reports against the Ukrainian president allege that he used offshore companies to move millions out of Ukraine. But despite these concerns, many feel Poroshenko will not go down without a fight. Post the spike in tensions with Russia, the Ukrainian president announced martial law in the country.
Оголошення війни. Україна ні з ким не планує воювати. Він запроваджується.
Poroshenko's proposal is seen as a diversionary tactic, one to avoid facing an election in March 2019. Opinion polls so far do not favor him, and some experts feel that martial law could be a way of Poroshenko to buy some more time and drum up some support in his favor. Bureau Report, WION, World is One.
As we said, the United Nations Security Council will meet shortly. The standoff comes weeks after NATO conducted its biggest war game since the Cold War and months after Russia conducted Vostok 2018, the biggest Russian war game since the Cold War. What are they preparing for? Many have asked. Was it just posturing or preparation for a conflict like this? Needless to say, an escalation will benefit no one.